Okay, so here we're going to talk today about an action research study that I did called the Effective Critical Thinking Skill Development on College Readiness. I'll explain a little bit about what an action study is, and I'll explain a little bit about my methods and the data that we collected. We'll also have time to go through some of the data together so that it makes sense and so that we can help draw some conclusions together. Here we go. To begin with, I used ACT-aligned assessments, which you all are obviously used to. I did a mixed methods data collection. I used quantitative data and qualitative data. And then I used both the histograms that are produced from the interim assessments, and I used a Likert scale to measure student self-efficacy, which I'll show you an example of too. So the reason that I did this, and the reason that I chose the topic that I chose, was because statewide only 55% of our students are college ready, and I feel like that's a pretty big problem. In Nelson County, you can see down here, it says that only 56%, only 1% higher, is college ready as well. To me, that's a big deal. Also, an average of nearly 30% of our students drop out their first year, which, I mean, we prepare them, we spend all this time working, and then this is what we end up with. Only 56% that are actually deemed college ready, and 30% of those drop out. So that's worrisome to me, which is why I did this study. A couple key terms that we looked at, or that I looked at or used, was college ready, which you guys know is the level of preparation that they have to be at to succeed without remediation. Critical thinking, which here just means that they're able to make judgments about something based on a well-supported hypothesis or well-supported evidence. And then higher order thinking skills are hot questions, like critical thinking, reflective thinking, metacognition, creative thinking, etc. So I won't walk you through the entire thing, but our literature review here focused in on 4 specific points. Looked at critical thinking. I looked at all the studies related to that. I looked at Bloom's taxonomy, so he's the father of how thinking builds. I looked at workforce readiness because ultimately that is the goal of college success, is obtaining some sort of job where you can maintain a lifestyle of your choosing. And then economic success, so how those jobs that our kids choose and how their graduation rate affects our economy. What really stood out to me in our literature review that I did was this percentage right here. It says there's been an 18% increase in the number of students who take the ACT yearly, which is great. In Kentucky, it's mandatory for all juniors. It's part of our public school, para-school testing. But the number of students meeting benchmark has actually remained static. And to me, I feel like the number, as the number of students rises that takes it, then the number meeting benchmark should also rise proportionally. So these are the 2 questions that I zoomed in on. First of all, how does teaching of critical thinking skills affect the college readiness score? And then secondly, how does teaching critical thinking skills contribute to their self-efficacy? So if they're able to complete these critical thinking skill pieces, then they should be able to, they should feel better about their ability to do so. So we're going to pause for a second. I want you to think about a hypothesis and the rationale behind that hypothesis, what you think or how you would answer those questions, and then we'll touch base here in a second. So I'm going to pause, let you access the PowerPoint, and then input what you think. All right, so what I saw that was common between all of our hypotheses and all the rationales, all of us believed that increasing those critical thinking skills would help to increase their college readiness scores as well as their self-efficacy. We all kind of phrased it differently, but for the most part, it's pretty common. Rationale-wise, I said that critical thinking was a major focus of standardized testing, like ACTs. Even if they're not familiar with the content, they're able to think critically and figure out an answer. That ability would create some increased self-efficacy. Kurt said that critical thinking could be used across all branches of knowledge, so it would be helpful throughout all content areas on those standardized tests. But unless it was repeated, that we wouldn't become a learned skill. And then Matt said that if they could normalize that skill, then it's something that could be embedded across all the curriculum that it would increase their scores too. So I think we're all on the same page, which is good. Good job. So this is how I conducted the research. It was considered quasi-experimental because I didn't have a control group. There were a couple other factors. The time was limited for the study. If I were to do it again, I would definitely have a control group and a treatment group and use them differently, or treat them differently. I had a mixed method data collection. So like I said, I collected both quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative data was collected through the ACT scores or the ACT interim assessment scores, and the qualitative data was collected using the Likert scale, which I'll show you an example of. I have some of the student examples that we'll take a look at. I did a closed reading and annotating authentic texts as the critical thinking skill, so that was how they dug into the information to build that skill base. I compared their scores over time. I looked at a couple different sets of scores. We'll look at the scores too from this most recent score, most recent test. It's a little shaky, but I'll explain why. And then also, like I said, I looked at the Likert scale, and I primarily focused on competence. So let's zoom in on research question 1 for a minute. It said, how does teaching of critical thinking skills affect the achievement of the college readiness scores? The people that I worked with were freshmen, so I teach. They're all from a variety of middle schools, and I felt like that had some bearing. You know, some kids from Bloomfield, some kids from Boston. They all come in with different levels of understanding. So those the first quarter scores may have been influenced by that. I had 3 AP mixed with my collaborative classes, mixed with my general population classes, so all the scores are very an average. We're in Nelson County. It's a fairly rural area, as you well know. Kids are ages 13 to 16, and I had about equal male versus females. 88 males and 90 females were tested. So I looked at interim assessment 1 through 3. I included 4, but I didn't use that as part of my analysis. We used the student IA analysis sheet that we developed last year. And I'll show you an example of some of the text that I used for them to annotate and how I did that in Google Drive. So this was one of the sample passages and the questions that were associated. They may and may not know or understand or heck even care what's going on here, but they can reason through this problem and use their critical thinking skills. That's what we were working towards. This is that IA analysis sheet that you guys worked on with me last year. They had their mastered standards on this side and their growth standards on this side, and then we went and did each individual question with them. I also analyzed it and looked at all the data. And then this was an example of the annotations. So you can see we had, in green, I had them highlight where their aha moments were or things that were significant to them. I had them highlight in yellow their important information or their key understandings. And then in pink, we talked about the vocabulary or things that they were unsure of, things that they needed to come back to. So that was an example of an article. It's an authentic text. It's something that I pulled directly from livescience.com, and it's relevant to our content. So this is the historic data with this yellow box right here. This is the one from this most recent one, this first quarter of this year. It's significantly lower, and I can explain why. The test has changed. The first 3 were a abbreviated version with fewer, less rigorous targets, whereas this one was a full practice plan test. So that's why the scores are very different. This is the one I actually want us to take a look at for a minute. So I'm going to pause it. I'm giving you room on the PowerPoint, so this is the next slide, where we can draw some conclusions together and think through this. So we're going to pause for just a minute, and then we'll touch base in a second. All right, so when we come back looking at the data, we're looking at this version of the data without this current year in it, since the data, how it was collected was different. But when we look at the conclusions, it seems to be sort of inconclusive data, really. There's no noticeable trends. We all noticed growth on the first 2 quarters for each of those years, but then a similar pattern for quarters 3 and quarter 4, depending on the student population that year. We know that the rigor increases in these last 2 quizzes, their last 2 tests, but their engagement also decreases. That's something we talked about too. There's lots of ups and downs, so nothing really that we can say if we go backwards to the question, we can't really affirmatively say that, yes, critical thinking skill development does affect the level of college readiness. However, let's think about things for just a minute. If we come back here and think about next steps, nice, I see that you already filled in there, so let's look at what we think. Maybe a different critical thinking skill could have been approached. Matt, you say that we need to increase student engagement through use of incentives or recognition. That makes sense. But I don't want to like give them candy for it, you know. So let's think about that, and then allowing students to be a bigger part of the process, making sure that they're aware of what's coming and why we're doing it. I think that is really important. It kind of makes me a little bit nervous about how we're going to disseminate that, especially to freshmen. I know it definitely makes sense for juniors, but I don't know that it makes sense for sophomores and freshmen yet, but we can think about that. And then I think this part right here was a good point. It said, does critical thinking, is reading and annotating really the critical thinking skills that should be focused on? So maybe if we switch that up, we could try a different critical thinking skill. I'm not sure, we'll have to brainstorm that a little bit. But that's definitely something that I'd like to look into. So the second research question that I looked at was how it increased their self-efficacy, or how teaching that skill increased their self-efficacy. So again, the same sampling of participants, a variety of middle school, they're all freshmen. I measured the pre-AP, the collab, and the general population together. I didn't separate any of that data. They're all young, 13 to 16, rural area, and a pretty split male-female population. This time I used all the same instruments except I introduced a Likert scale. It's a scale that I use to talk mostly about confidence. Let me get you a sample here real quick. Sorry. These are some of my first periods. And this is the first data point that I've collected on this, so it's going to be hard to compare any data. I split them by kids who seem to be confident based on their answers versus students who are not as confident about their self-efficacy. So this is a perception survey is what I called it. You can take a look at that. I really like this last part. It said, finish the sentence. If you knew me, you would know blank. This has been a really good way to get to know them, and I plan on implementing this once per quarter, so it's coming up here soon. If I use the IA analysis, use the annotations, this is an example of the survey too. So it's in your PowerPoint, you can take a look, but you can look at the student samples too. And this is how I predicted that their self-efficacy would change over time. So I assumed in the beginning it wouldn't be so great versus the end it would get, they would be more and more towards the strongly disagree side. So all of the questions, if they answer in the affirmative, it means that they're more confident. So 1 was a strongly disagree, and 4 was a strongly agree. So I expected it to start this way and then flip the other direction based on their skill development. I will take a look at that the next quarter, and that's something that we can definitely come back to. I think that this is relevant throughout the year anyway, no matter what we're teaching. So let's think about next steps for a minute, and then we will reflect about some takeaways. So I'm going to pause for a second, give you a chance to think about next steps, and then we will touch base. All right, so next steps. Obviously, we should get more data points for our research 2 question, and we will. We'll come back to that. If critical thinking changes, will that affect the outcome of this research? Oh, like if the critical thinking skill changes, so instead of reading and annotating, if we chose a different skill to embed, would that help to increase critical thinking more, or would that help to increase their self-efficacy more? Can students be more involved in this piece as well? This is kind of what I was thinking. Can students be more a part of this process? Can they take more ownership for their own learning, or their ownership for their own we talk about growth mindset a little bit later in the year. Maybe that should be a big push right from the get-go. They're really involved in our data analysis pieces, but as far as the self-efficacy pieces, I just collected the data and then analyzed it myself. And really that was just me looking through it and putting them into two piles, confident and not confident. I think that process can be refined, and then maybe we could draw some better conclusions from that as we get more data, like Matt said. So some of the reflections or the takeaways that we came up with, Kirk says that critical thinking is key to being successful. We all know that. Fortune 500 companies want people who can think critically, but how do we generate some actual data that links that skill to that success? I don't know that maybe this particular skill development piece was effective since our data was inconclusive and since we didn't really see any trends. But maybe if we tried a different critical thinking skill to develop, maybe that would be something that would help us to link those two things better. Matt says that students need to have ownership, which I agree. We can help do this by increasing their ability to think critically. And of course, as I just said a minute ago, that data was inconclusive, but student self-efficacy should increase over time in every content area, in every school year. So is there anything that we can do specifically to do that? And I think the growth mindset lessons that we've implemented before in our leader prep classes or throughout those could really be successful or help us to develop success in that area. And then we talked a little bit about how can we help students play a role in determining their own success. So I think that's something we're all invested in, and I think that's something that we can continue to delve into later. So thank you for your time. These are references. If you should like to continue to look at some of this information, there's a lot of really good studies out there that I looked at. I actually didn't mind doing it. The amount of time that it took, but I liked the information that I found, and I like this theme. I think this is something that we can continue to draw on for the rest of this year at least. Thank you.